Good morning, everybody. This morning we're going to study Psalm 124. I should be dead. I thought I was on that proverbial train that was going to wreck, but as it turned out, God had his hand on me. I should be dead. Psalm 24 is another Song of Ascents. It is classified by the Broadman commentary as a community or communal Thanksgiving psalm. There are 2 points to this outline. Verses 1 through 5, what could have happened had God not delivered them? And verses 6 through 8 calls for praise of Yahweh for what he has done on behalf of his people. All right, there is repetition, which tends to bind verses, repetitions of words and phrases that tends to bind verses and themes together. For example, verse 2a is a verbatim repeat of verse 1a. Verses 3 through 5 all begin with the same Hebrew word azay, A-Z-A-Y, which means then. Verses 4 and 5 have the phrase Abar al-Napshu, which means swept us away or passed over us, and they function as transition phrases. Then there's verse 7a and 7b. It contains the word P-A-H, pa, meaning snare or trap. So let's get into it. Let me read verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 124. If the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say, if the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, comma. All right. The intent of this repeated phrase, if the Lord had not been on our side, is to point out the claim that the Lord is on our side. At least he was when the given calamity occurred. The idea is that it is the Lord, Yahweh, who protects Israel. The threat to Israel is identified as people. Right there at the end of verse 2, when people attacked us, the threat to Israel is identified as people or men in some translations who attack. It is translated from the Hebrew word Adam, A-D-A-M. And it says they were angry with us. We'll see that in just a second. We will see that these people who attack Israel are human enemies described in metaphoric terms in the coming verses, metaphoric terms. All right, let's look at verse 3. Verse 3 says, let me read verse 2 into verse 3 again. If the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive when their anger flared against us. Wow. The most graphic example of being swallowed alive comes from Numbers 16:34. Let me read that to you. It goes back to some stuff we studied in Jude. Numbers 16:34. We're talking about the ground swallowing up. 16:34 says this. At their cries, all the Israelites around them fled, shouting, the earth is going to swallow us too. The earth is going to swallow us too. If you recall from our study of Jude 11, verse 11, verse C, the third part of verse 11, the perishing of Korah. Korah criticized Moses as being responsible for exalting himself to a high position. Korah ignored the commands of, well, let's see, rather than his exaltation, Korah criticized Moses as being responsible for his own exaltation rather than his exaltation coming at the direction of God. Korah ignored the commands of God at the same time. All of Korah's problems came out at the hands of jealousy and pride and arrogance. He wanted what Moses had as prophet and priest rather than the great job that he had. If you recall, you may not know this if you didn't go through that study with me in Jude, but Korah was a Levite, but he was not a priest. His clan was responsible for maintaining all of the holy things and moving them. When the tabernacle would move, they're the ones that had to pack it all up and move it. And they had the holy things. He was responsible for the Ark of the Covenant, all of the utensils used in the tabernacle, and all the things labeled as holy. They were the ones that were responsible for moving them. That is a great job. How would you like to say, I was the one that had to move the Ark of the Covenant? But he thought that was beneath him, and he needed a job like Moses had. The end result was that Moses called for a meeting to let God judge who was right and who was the godly one. Okay, so they had this meeting, and the ground opened up. It was like a giant sinkhole. That's what I called it when we studied Jude, or studied that verse in Jude. It was like a giant sinkhole, and what it did, it swallowed Korah and his family. And there was a man there named Dathan. He's the guy you know from the Exodus when Moses was up on the mountain. He was kind of leading the charge of spiritual and physical infidelity. And he and his family, and a man named Abiram with his family, all three of those men and their families were swallowed up. They were alive and kicking at one time, 1 minute, and the next thing they disappeared from sight into this sinkhole, never to be seen again. They were swallowed up. That's what we were talking about here. They were swallowed up. It's an example from being swallowed up in the Bible. We've got that whole video on Korah that goes through all the details of that. Okay, there was other cases. Recall the report of God's protection of Israel at the Red Sea. You know the details. Israel was backed up against the Red Sea with the Egyptian army coming. Their demise was imminent. They were expecting complete destruction. And so I want to look at some of the details of that just to get an idea here about swallowed up. Exodus 14, verse 21. Exodus 14:21. Should have marked it, sorry. Exodus 14:21 says this. Then Moses stretched out his hand. You know the details, but we need to go through it. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry ground. And then in verse 22, the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground. And if you recall, the Egyptian army was coming. They were coming for them. The water was on the right and on their left. And then verse 20, that was verse 22. Verse 23 says, the Egyptians pursued them, and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. Verse 24 says, during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. God did that. God is starting to look like God was on the side of the Israelites. He threw the Egyptian army into confusion. And then verse 25 says, He jammed the wheels of their chariots, so they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." So even the Egyptian army recognized that God was involved on the side of the Israelites. So then a little bit later in Exodus 15, there's a song. It's called the Song of the Sea, and it explains, they go through it. So Moses, is singing the song, and maybe some others, but the Song of the Sea explains the details of the incident of the Egyptians when they were defeated, when the earth swallowed the enemies of Israel, is what it says. Exodus 15 verse 12 says this: "You stretched out your right hand." This is part of that Song of the Sea. "You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies." So there's another example of being swallowed up by your problems, with God fighting on your side. So then there's one other we're not going to go through, but Nebuchadnezzar was, when he defeated Israel, they were described as being swallowed up by the enemy. It's in Isaiah 49:19 and Jeremiah 51:34. There's no reason for us to go read it. But so you don't have to look very far to find such things described as being swallowed up in Scripture. All right, verse 4 and 5. Let me read verse 4 and 5. The flood, well, he goes back to starting in verse 2. Let me read verse 2 into verse 3 and then into verse 4 and 5. "If the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive when their anger flared against us. The flood would have engulfed us, the torrent would have swept over us, the raging waters would have swept us away." And then verse 5, "Praise be to the Lord who has not let us be torn by their teeth." All right, verses 4 and 5 give testimony to the devastating nature of floods and raging waters which swept over us or swept us away, would have swept us away. They were still metaphors for what the enemy of Israel could have done if God had not been on their side. So we're talking about floods and raging waters sweeping over somebody, but they're metaphors for the enemy. That's what the enemy would have done. They would have swept over them. They would have swept them away. They would have engulfed them had God not been on their side. The word "us" in the NIV and the ESV is translated from the word nephesh. There is that word again. That is a big word in the Bible. We need to make sure we don't ever forget it. It's a big word to me. That word is translated as "us" in the NIV and in the ESV and maybe some others. Some translations actually say "our soul." You recall, nephesh is what man became when God breathed the breath of life into him at creation. He formed him from the dust of the earth. He breathed the breath of life into him, and he came to life, and he became a nephesh. He became a living soul. So what that indicates is that is the completeness of man. He is exactly what God created him to be, and he is full. He's a living soul. Okay, that word is used here. He says "our soul." The torrent would have swept over our soul. The raging waters would have swept our soul away. What it is, it's a combination of the completeness of man with the completeness of his problem that his enemy is creating. The man is complete, and he is completely engulfed by the raging waters. That's how that gets into this. The completeness of man is completely engulfed. Had God not been on his side, they would have been swept away. For verses 3 through 5, the swallowing, the floods, and the raging waters are metaphors for their enemies. So we can't really lose sight of that. Had God not been on their side, they would have been swallowed up, they would have been swept over, or they would have been swept away. They were painted as being powerless against such forces. If God had not been on their side, they would have been powerless against such things. Okay, I like to think of the term God being on their side as God having his hand on them. Can you see where I'm going with that? God is on their side. He has his hand on them. God has his purposes in the things he does. In some of these examples, many people died. But the end result was deliverance because God had his hand on them. God has had his hand on me ever since I was 10 years old. And I do not know the details of your life, but if you are a Christian, I know he has had his hand on you as well. This does not mean that our lives have been lived without problems or picture perfect by human perspectives, but looking back, I can see God everywhere. Looking back into my life, there have been times when I felt the floodwaters would have engulfed me. I could have just been swallowed right up. But I know God was right there with me through it all. I want to show you something we've looked at many times before. It's out of Psalms 25. Psalm 25, verses 15 to 18. Let me read that to you. Psalm 25, verses 15 to 18. My eyes are ever on the Lord. Now, think of this in perspective of being in a situation where you just feel like you're going to be swept away or swept under the flood or engulfed. Just think of your problems, the time in your life when you were having that kind of a feeling. Then now listen to Psalm 25, verses 15 to 18. My eyes are ever on the Lord, for only he will release my feet from the snare. I want you to remember that word. We're going to talk about it in a minute. Only he could release my feet from the snare or a trap. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and free me from my anguish. Look on my affliction and my distress and take away all my sins. All right. In the New Living Translation, verse 17, let me read verse 17 to you again. It said, relieve my troubles the troubles of my heart and free me from my anguish. In the New Living Translation, that is translated as when my problems go from bad to worse. That's starting to sound like being engulfed by something, doesn't it? When my problems go from bad to worse. But I know I have a God who loves me and watches over me. I call on him in verse 15. Verse 15 said, my eyes are ever on the Lord, for only he will release my feet from the snare. Remember that word snare. I feel like I was in a trap from which I could only be released by God. Okay, then it takes us back to verse 120, chapter 124 again. Verses 6 through 8 indicate the results of God having been involved in your life or in my life or in their life. It's the results of having him in our life. What would have happened? Verse 6 says this. Praise be to the Lord who has not let us be torn by their teeth. Praise be to the Lord. He is my friend. I know him. I am protected from that buzzsaw here described as the teeth of the enemy ready to tear me up. Because God is in my life. Not that it's going to be picture perfect by any means, but I know him. He is my friend. He watches for me and cares for me. Verse 7, we have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare. You remember I told you that word snare? Only God can do it. We have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken and we have escaped. There's that word snare. I told you to watch for it in Psalm 25:15. I was in a snare, in a trap. I'm saying me, you've been there too. I was in a snare, in a trap from which only God can release me. Yet here I am, far from it, free from it, far from that problem. There will be more, but God will be there as well. My life has been perfect, has not been perfect, and without what most people consider as problems. I learned something in our classroom one time. I was teaching, I was actually getting ready to teach, and Nancy Mitchell was one of the ladies in my class for a long, long time, 10 years probably. She was in there, and I was getting ready to teach, and I was just doing a lead into the lesson, and I was talking about what a harried week I had, describing all the problems I had to encounter, all the pressures of the week that I had. And Nancy said, "You don't have any problems." I had to laugh. She was so right. How true that is. She was right. We fail to remember sometimes that God's eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. All right, let's look at verse 8, then we'll be through. Verse 8, our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Our help is in his name. His name describes who he is. His name is Elohim. He is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. His name is Yahweh. He is our covenant God, the one who has made eternal promises to us. His name is Yahweh Jireh. He provides for us. His name is Yahweh Rophi. He heals us through all of our hurts. He is truth. We can count on what he says. He is faithful. He stands behind his word. His name is Adonai. He is the master of our lives. His name is Jesus. He died for me. His name is Holy Spirit. He guides me. Right there in verse 8b, he is the maker of heaven and earth, our creator. I know him, and he is my friend. That's all I have for you this morning. Thank you for listening.